Dear Chair, dear audience, my PhD topic is exploring HPV-associated diseases and their preventive measures. My name is Adél Mózes. I'm a first-year PhD student. My mission is to decrease the prevalence of HPV-caused diseases, and my vision is to find the best options for HPV prevention and detection. Allow me to introduce our two specific goals. Our first is to reveal the prevalence and risk of oral HPV infection in cervical HPV-positive women through a systematic review and meta-analysis. And the second one is to analyze the concordance and risk factors between oral and genital HPV within a single-center cohort analysis. So let's jump to our first project, which started in September. As you know, human papillomavirus is the most common sexually transmitted pathogen of the 21st century, causing more than 5% of the cancers worldwide. Besides cervical cancer, HPV can also cause anal, vaginal, vulvar, and penile cancer, and here I have to highlight the HPV-caused oropharyngeal cancers, the prevalence of which has quadrupled in the recent years. Therefore, our aim is to identify the association between cervical and oral HPV infection. Our first clinical question is, what is the prevalence of oral HPV infection in women with cervical HPV? We hypothesize that women with cervical HPV infection have a high prevalence of oral HPV. And our second, does cervical HPV infection increase the risk of oral HPV in women? We hypothesize that cervical HPV infection increases the risk of oral HPV in women. We conducted our search in 3 separate databases with the search key below. After the selection, we ended up with 41 eligible full texts. We measured our outcomes in odds ratio or proportion with a 95% confidence interval. And allow me to introduce our results. In this first result, we measured the outcome in odds ratio with a 95% confidence interval. So here, we investigated how many women had oral HPV in the cervical HPV positive versus the cervical HPV negative group. We included 34 cross-sectional studies with more than 5,000 patients. The heterogeneity was moderate, which can be explained by the different oral sampling techniques and kits, the globally and individually different sexual habits, and the HPV positivity or negativity of the sexual partner. And we got that the odds of having oral HPV in the cervical positive group is 2.22 times higher compared to the cervical HPV negative group. Our result is clinically and statistically significant. When we measured the outcome in proportion with a 95% confidence interval, and we investigated how many women had oral HPV in the cervical HPV positive versus the cervical HPV negative group, we included 34 and 41 cross-sectional studies with more than 2,000 and 4,000 patients. The heterogeneity was high, which can be explained by the same as I mentioned before. And we got that the prevalence of oral HPV in women without cervical HPV is only 4%, and the prevalence of oral HPV in women with cervical HPV is 13%. Our result is also clinically significant. Globally, the prevalence of oral HPV is between 5 and 10%. When we created a subgroup for women with cervical HPV and with positive cytology, and we measured the outcome in proportion, we got an even higher number, 17%, which is quite reasonable, because those who have positive cytology have had HPV infection for longer, presumably giving the virus more time to infect the oral cavity during sexual activity. Among the strength, we present worldwide data. We confirmed HPV infection by PCR in all studies. Among the limitations, I have to highlight there is not a standardized oral sampling technique, and they used a little different tests and kits in the studies, but that's why we set a minimum genotype requirement. We can conclude that women with cervical HPV have a 2.20 times higher odds for oral HPV positivity, and 1 out of 8 women with cervical HPV has oral HPV positivity. For practice, we imply that oral HPV screening should be recommended for women with cervical HPV infection. There is a need to raise awareness for oral HPV and its risk for cancer, and the HPV vaccination should be emphasized. For research, we imply that the effectiveness of oral HPV testing in the early diagnosis of oropharyngeal cancer should be investigated. Here you can see the progress of our first project. We are at the very end of writing our manuscript, and we are planning to send it to internal review by the end of the week. And our targeted journal is the Journal of the Dental Research. And let's move on to our second project, which started in November. HPV infects the oral cavity and oropharynx through oral sex, while there is cervical HPV screening, and the number of the cervical cancer is decreasing in the Western world. Until then, there is no standardized oral HPV screening, and the number of the oropharyngeal cancer is steadily increasing in the Western world. There are some well-known risk factors for oral HPV, like greater number of lifetime sexual partners, smoking, or stress. Therefore, our aim is to identify the risk factors and the association between genital and oral HPV infection. Our first question, what is the concordance between oral and genital HPV in women and men? And we hypothesize there is concordance between them. The clinical implication would be to determine who should be screened for oropharyngeal cancer prevention. And the second question is, how do lifestyle factors influence HPV positivity in women and men? We hypothesize that some lifestyle factors are associated with HPV positivity. The clinical implication would be to identify who needs close follow-up and screening. We are at the protocol drafting phase. We have more than 4,000 patients' data. We are set an inclusion criteria, and we are planning to include patients who have both the genital and oral samples. Here you can see a summary of our aims with the planned submission dates. And to quote Albert Einstein finally, the more I learn, the more I realize how much I don't know. Thank you for your attention.
I have a question for your first project. You said that the limitation of this project that the articles use different sample methods. What kind of sample methods are used, and what is the difference between them, and what is your recommendation? Which one is the best?
Thank you for your question. They used two kinds of sampling methods in the oral region. The first one is the brushing methods, when they use cytobrush or some other brush to exfoliate the cells, and the other method is the rinsing technique, when they use some liquid to rinse, and that's how they collect the cells. They use the alcohol or water, and there were differences. We created a subgroup for this, but we cannot conclude anything. They were basically the same, and this is implication for research too, that we or they should create a validated, standardized oral sampling technique and method.
Do you know that there are many types of HPV inoculation, and if yes, which one do you recommend?
Yes, there are a few types of HPV vaccine, and I would recommend at the moment the Gardasil 9, which can protect you against 7 high-risk HPV types, which are detected in the 90% of the HPV-caused cancers. This is the most effective at the moment.
I had a question for one of your plots. The prevalence of oral HPV was like 3% in the first study, and in the last study was like 90-something%. Do you have any explanation for that? I think with the positive cytology as well, the last plot you presented.
Yes, here?
Yes, so the first few studies like only 3%, and the last one is 92%. Like, do you have any explanation, like what happened in the last 3 studies, maybe why the prevalence are so high in this population?
Okay, so in the Crawford study, there were women mostly used oral contraceptives, which is a well-known factor for long-time HPV, and that's why. But in the Crawford study, it's a very big number, actually. In the Zonta studied a female prison population, and almost all were smokers, which is also a risk factor for long-standing HPV. And Adamopoulos used the nested PCR technique, which is a more sensitive technique than the regular PCR technique.
All right, great. Yeah, that's worth
Yes,
highlighting this in the discussion
they are
part.
outliers,
So,
yes.
Yeah.
I just had a question about the current clinical practices. So when there's a suspected patient with HPV, do they do oral screening right now or just genital screening?
No, they don't really do the oral screening. So actually, the one validated test is the cervical HPV screening. So if you have a partner who has positive cytology and they did the HPV DNA testing, and she knows that, oh, I have HPV, there are some clinics where you can go that my partner has HPV and I want to screen my genital region or my oral region, but there is not a standardized sampling technique for oral HPV or, for example, perineal HPV screening. But they do in some private clinic.